All right. All right. Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. We're going to talk about Surah At-Tariq today, and we'll talk a little bit more about what At-Tariq means. But this is a surah that was revealed in Mecca, probably towards the end towards the end of the time that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was going to be in Mecca. You know, he was in Mecca for about 13 years, and this was probably towards the end of that period. Maybe the 36th or so surah that was revealed, according to a lot of the mufassirun. And just like any of the other surahs in this juz, it's going to really focus on the concept of resurrection, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about why this is such a oft-repeated theme in the Meccan surahs, which are usually the majority of the surahs in this last juz of the Quran. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins by saying was-sama'i wat-tariq. Now, was-sama' is not "and the sky," but Allah is swearing by the sky. The literal translation is "and the sky," but in the Arabic language, when you begin a sentence with what and then the thing with a kasra at the end of it, so you see this little kasra here, that means that is an oath. So Allah is making an oath. He is swearing by the sky and by the tariq. Now, what is tariq? Now, that's interesting. Tariq, the term tariq comes from turuq, which means, it literally means to hit something. Like, you know, the tariq in the Arabic language is a path. And it's called that because people have walked on it and their feet have hit the path over and over again. And it's created a straight line, right? So that's why a tariq is called a tariq, because it comes from turuq, which means to constantly hit something. And the other way in which this term was typically used was hitting a door to knock, right? And the Arabs, what happened is at nighttime, when they wanted to visit someone, they would get close to the area and they couldn't see the house too well because it's fully dark. This is a hard concept for us to understand, but we live in a society where there's a ton of artificial light. So even when the sun goes down, you could be walking on a street here in America and you wouldn't even know that it's nighttime because everything is so lit, right? Until you look up at the sky and you see it's dark. But back then, it wasn't like that. There was no artificial light. When the sun went down, things got dark. And if you wanted to visit someone's home at night, you would get close to the area. You can't see a thing. Only if it's a full moon can the reflection of the moon give you a little bit of light, but you can't see a thing. So when you thought you were close, what they used to do is they would take a rock or something and they would hit it against something, right? And that was like their knocking, okay? And that was their turuq, right? And so that process of turq, right, knocking, over time it became synonymous with someone who visited at night, right? And so the tariq, the knocker, became known as the night visitor. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then is saying that he is swearing by the sky, which is a tremendous oath to take, right? Because we know that the sky is not just one sky, it is 7 heavens. 7 heavens that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has built. All what we see, the sky above us, the Milky Way, right? The light years of distancing that has been discovered throughout space via Hubble telescopes and everything, is just the first firmament. That is the first heaven, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created 7 heavens. Each heaven, relative to the one above it, is like a ring in the desert. So you can imagine a ring in the desert. And then the heaven above that is like a ring in the desert relative to the heaven above it. And that one relative to the 4th heaven is like a ring in the desert. So what is the 1st heaven relative to the 7th heaven? It is beyond comprehension. That is a tremendous creation by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says, أَنْتُمْ أَشَدُّ خَلْقًا أَمِ السَّمَاءُ بَنَاهَا. Are you a more difficult creation to create, or the heavens above you. He says that in Surah Nazi'at. And so our creation is nothing. It's nothing. We're nothing, right? The heavens that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala constructed above us is a much more tremendous creation. Allah swears by that, and then he swears by this night visitor. But the night visitor isn't what you think, i.e. the Arab, the Meccan Arab who's listening to this, who thinks by Tariq, a Tariq is the one who comes at night and hits on something to say, hey, I'm here, open the door, because no one can see anyone, right? It's not what you think. The very next line that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says is that the Tariq is, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الطَّارِقُ, and what will let you know what a Tariq is. Now this is, like a usage in the Quran. Like for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Al-Haq, Mal-Haq, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا-Haq, the truth, right? What is the truth? And what will let you know what the truth is, right? Or for example, in Qariya, Al-Qariya, Mal-Qariya, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا-Qariya, right? The Qariya, what will let you know what the Qariya is? It's a type of linguistic style that creates anticipation, right, from the listener. It also kind of denotes this idea that what it is very, very difficult to comprehend, right? And there's a chance you may not be able to comprehend it, right? So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says what the Tariq is, right? And the Tariq is an-najm al-thaqib. The najm is the star, right? And al-thaqib means piercing. So now this is interesting. This is a new understanding now for the Arab who has never, kind of been exposed to this kind of metaphor. To them, the Tariq was just a person who came at night and would hit on something or knock on something to say, I'm here. But now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says there's something between that night visitor, right, and the star that pierces the night of the sky that is similar, right? And so there's a lot of different opinions of what the Najm al-Thaqib is. Some people say the way to understand this is like when the sun goes down in the night sky, as it gets darker and darker, all of a sudden it's like all of a sudden you see a star come in like a nail that would go through a door. It just pierces it. It kind of like pierces the sky, right? Some have said that in that sense, it's kind of like that. Others have said it's the shooting star, right? It's the shooting star because the shooting star is kind of like moving about through the heaven, like the night visitor moves about through the neighborhood, right? While everything else is still, all the other stars are still, and this one star kind of goes through like that. And others have said, others have had different opinions that this is in reference to Saturn. The Arabs, they had this kind of really kind of like, biased interest towards the star Saturn for some reason. Others have said it's the constellation Pleiades, right? They were very familiar with the constellation Pleiades. In fact, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, one time when he was embracing Salman al-Farisi, one of the converts from Persia, he says, if faith were ever to reach Tharya, the constellation of Pleiades, it would be a man from this person's lineage or a man from this person's people who would reach it, right? And Salman al-Farisi being Persian, some people said that might have been in reference to Abu Hanifa. Some people said that might have been in reference to Imam Ghazali, the famous Persian scholars. But they were familiar with Pleiades. They were familiar with Saturn. They were familiar with some of the major constellations that we know of today. So there's a lot of different opinions. You see here, I purposely kind of brought a lot of different translations on the screen so you can see here the piercing star, the piercing brightness, but a lot of them have also kind of said that this is the shooting star that you see at night. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the purpose here, the point here, is to make an oath by a tremendous creation. Remember when we talked about Surah Shams, Allah says, وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا وَالْقَمَرِ إِذَا تَلَاهَا. The sun, right? Allah swears by the sun and its brightness, the moon, how it follows it. Allah swears by the day, by the night, and all these things. These are tremendous creations of Allah. It's always followed Whenever Allah swears by a tremendous creation, it's followed by a very, very important statement, right? It directs your attention to something that you know is tremendous already because you see it every day, to something now you may not know is tremendous because you haven't thought about it. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings that next thing into play. And what is that? That is this next verse, verse number 4. In kullu nafsin lamma alayha hafiz. Indeed, every soul, every, kullu is every, and nafs is soul. Lamma in the Arabic language, using different Arab dialects and different Arab tribes would say lamma in reference to illa. So it really means except, okay? So the verse is saying there's not a single soul except alayha. Upon it is what? A hafiz. What is a hafiz? A hafiz is a preserver, okay? Or a protector. So here's the answer to the swear. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala swears by the tremendousness of the heavens. And Allah swears by the tremendousness or the magnificence or the brilliance of the piercing stars at night, or a shooting star at night, which captures everyone's eye, right? And we, honestly, when you live in a big city like we do, we don't see the night sky. The night sky is obscured by a lot of artificial light. If you ever go to like Grand Canyon, where artificial light is like limited by law, or you go to like some remote place out in the western part of the country or something like that, where you're kind of away from civilization, and you look up at night, then you see the stars. The stars are amazing. It's an amazing sight. It's an absolutely amazing sight. We don't really see it here because of the artificial light. But Allah swears by these two creations to point out the importance of this one statement. Every soul has a preserver on it, a protector on it. Hafiz is not just protector, but it's someone who's preserving. And what that's in reference to is the angels that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has assigned to us to write down every single thing that we do and say. مَا يَلْفِظُ مِنْ قَوْلٍ إِلَّا لَدَيْهِ رَقِيبٌ عَتِيدٌ. Allah says in Surah Qaf that a single word does not come out of your mouth except that there is a watcher patiently waiting to record it, right? And everything that we say and everything that we do is going to be recorded. These recordings then form our book, right? And that book is what's going to be given to us on the day of judgment, right? And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is essentially making an indirect reference to the day of judgment by telling the Arab, the pagans, the Meccans, that everything that you do, everything that you say, it's going to be recorded in a book, and it will be brought back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you will be taken into account for every single one of these things. The thing is, and I'll just take a couple minutes to say this. Why is resurrection? Why is accountability? Why is the day of judgment, which is this verse is making an indirect reference to, because you're going to be given your day of your book on the day of judgment, right? Why are all of these things constantly repeated in this last juz? Because this last juz predominantly contains Meccan surahs. This is the last part of the Quran, but it's really the first part of Revelation, okay? The Quran is not a linear book. And who was the Quran speaking to predominantly in the early stages of Mecca in the first part of Revelation? These Meccans who this was a completely lawless society and just an unbelievably immoral society. I mean, we're talking women would set up tents and put a flag outside their tent, and so any guy was welcome to come in, and she would just go pick a father sometime later. We're talking about a society where people made tawaf around the Kaaba naked. That's how they made tawaf around the Kaaba, naked, right? We're talking about a society where people would be drunk at night, constantly drinking alcohol from Maghrib all the way to sunrise the next day. They're just drunk, singing, whatever, doing all these different things. We're talking about a society where people would bury their daughters alive. They would bury their daughters alive, right? وَإِذَا بُشِّرَ أَحَدُهُمْ بِالْأُنْثَى ظَلَّ وَجْهُهُ مُسْوَدًّا. These are people who, when they were given tidings, when they were told that, oh, congratulations, you're a father, you have a beautiful daughter, their face would become black and red with rage, right? And they would just go bury the daughter right there, alive. That's the type of society we were in. In this type of society, you don't tell people what they need to do. Like, okay, guys, you need to start fasting. You need to start praying. You need to start, giving zakat and all these things. You don't start with what. You start with why. You start with who, right? The what comes later. Alcohol wasn't prohibited until 17 years. 17 years after the initial revelation. You know what was happening all that time for Muslims? Allah was just building their faith. And faith begins with belief in resurrection. That's where it begins. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is addressing the root cause of all the immorality, sexual, behavioral, killing, civil, vigilantism, so on and so forth that is occurring in society. All of this because of a lack of monotheism, a lack of tawheed, a lack of belief in resurrection. That's the root of it. Polytheism is the root of all evil. It is the root of all evil. So the reason this theme keeps coming up over and over again is because this is the basis for where good deeds come from. Belief is the basis from where good deeds come from. Belief is the tree. Good deeds are the fruit. And if you don't address belief, you'll never get good deeds. And this is something we can apply to ourselves just as Muslims. A lot of us go through the motions. We never really went through a period where we ask ourselves, where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? Like I'll tell you, I'm a convert to Islam, okay? I wasn't born Muslim, right? And that's where my faith started. When I first read the Quran, those are the questions I was looking for. The verses that talk about resurrection, the verses that talk about the day of judgment, this is what made the hair on my skin stand up, right? And this is where my faith started from. All of the what you do came later for me. But for me, belief in resurrection and belief in accountability, right? And starting from there, that's where everything started from. So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes this and continues with it. فَلْيَنْظُرِ الْإِنسَانِ مِمَّا خُلِقَ. Let man look or contemplate mankind from what he was created from. Why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say this? Because if an indirect reference now is being made to the day of judgment, into resurrection and how you're going to be accountable for your deeds, one might say, well, that's impossible. And that's what the Meccans would say. They would say, that's not going to happen. That's impossible. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Allah knows where you came from, right? Look at where you came from, right? خُلِقَ مِن مَاءٍ دَافِقٍ. You were created from a fluid that is gushed forth, right? If Allah knows and Allah is familiar with the nuances of where you came from, don't you think that He knows where you're going? Don't you think that He knows where you're going to end up? And that is going to be kind of continued in the next following verses as well. But it's already 7:24. I thought I was going to get through this whole surah in one day. Why don't we pause here, and the next 8 or 9 verses or so, we'll, inshallah, we'll continue tomorrow. I'll hand it back over to Sister Yasmin.